The shuttle docked quietly, and Dale stepped out into a station that had not been built for him. He noticed it immediately, the way a person notices a shoe that does not quite fit. The ceiling in the docking corridor was too high. Not unusually high, not dangerously high, just high enough that the space above his head felt empty in a way that was uncomfortable without being explainable. The walls were a pale color that was almost white, but not quite. Something slightly off in the tone that made everything feel faintly cold. The floor hummed under his feet with the vibration of the station's systems, a frequency that was just low enough to feel in the chest rather than hear with the ears. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder and kept walking. Accord Station sat in orbit around a dead star at the far edge of human-explored space. That was what the agreement had said. Neutral ground, chosen by both sides, acceptable to all parties. Dale had read the agreement carefully before departure, and had thought at the time that neutral sounded fair. Walking through the station now, he understood that neutral was a word with a great deal of room inside it, and the Accord had used all of that room very deliberately. The rest of the human delegation moved through the corridor behind him. Mira walked near the front of the group, her bag over one shoulder, her eyes moving steadily over everything she passed: walls, junctions, doorways, the positions of Accord staff standing at intervals along the route. She had a way of looking at a room that suggested she was filing it away for later, building a complete picture from individual pieces. She had been doing this since before the shuttle landed, Dale suspected, possibly since before they left home. Envoy Junho walked at the center of the group. He was not a tall man, and he was not a loud one, and neither of those things had ever seemed to matter. There was something about the way he moved through a space that made the space feel like he had always been in it. Unhurried, completely present. He looked at the high ceiling once, briefly, and then he looked ahead and kept walking and did not look at it again. The first session was scheduled for the following morning. That evening, the delegation settled into their assigned quarters, rooms that were, like everything else on the station, slightly wrong for human proportions, and Mira gathered the senior staff in the common area to go over the next day's structure. The meeting was short and practical. Everybody knew their role. When it was done, most of them went to sleep. Dale sat by the small viewport in his room for a while, before sleeping. Outside, in the dark, he could see the distant glimmer of human ships, their own escort vessels, parked at the coordinates the Accord had specified, well outside the station's sensor range. It was another condition the Accord had set. Human military vessels were not permitted within close range of the station during talks. For safety, the agreement said. For the integrity of the neutral environment. He looked at those distant lights for a long time. Then he went to sleep. The first session opened the next morning, in a chamber that Dale understood immediately had been designed with intention. The ceiling was higher here than anywhere else on the station. The table was enormous, wide enough that the two sides felt genuinely far apart. The Accord delegation's chairs were built to their own proportions and fit them well. A human delegation's chairs were a close match, but not exact. Slightly too wide in the seat, slightly too tall in the back. Just enough to create a faint, constant reminder that these were not chairs that had been made with human bodies in mind. The light was worst. The chamber's main light source was positioned directly in the faces of the human side of the table. Not blinding, not aggressive, just present, steady, and aimed in a direction that meant the Accord delegation sat in comfortable shadow, while the humans sat in full light. Every expression on the human side was clearly visible. The Accord side was harder to read. Dale wrote all of it down in his notes. Small observations, recorded carefully, because Mira had told him early on that small observations were often the ones that mattered most later. Counselor Vale opened the session. He was the lead voice of the Galactic Accord at the table. An experienced diplomat, from a species that had been managing galactic relationships for longer than humanity had been traveling between stars. He spoke well. Every sentence was balanced. Every point was framed with care. And the overall impression he gave was of someone who was simply trying to help everyone arrive at a reasonable outcome together. It was a good performance. Dale could recognize a performance while still admiring the quality of it. Vale began by listing what he called the circumstances that had made these talks necessary. He spoke about the Cathara systems, the 3 human colony systems that the Accord had blockaded without warning 2 years ago. He did not call it a blockade. He called it a stabilization measure, implemented in response to what he described as unsanctioned human expansion into contested navigational corridors. When he was finished, the blockade had become an act of responsible governance, and the humans had become the party that had created the conditions requiring a response. Junho listened to every word without interruption. His face showed nothing. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, perfectly still. When Vale finished, Junho asked 2 short, precise questions about the timeline of events Vale had described, noted the answers without comment, and moved on. Then the Accord's opening offer was placed on the table. Dale read it and kept his face still the way Mira had told him to, always in session. The offer required the Human Confederacy to surrender navigational rights to 6 border systems. It required the acceptance of Accord observation vessels operating inside human space on a permanent basis. It required the payment of reparations to the Accord for the cost, it said, of the stabilization measure the Accord had chosen to impose. Humanity was being asked to pay for the blockade that had been placed around its own people. Junho read the document fully. He asked one clarifying question. He said the human delegation would review the offer and respond at the following session. He thanked Vale for his time. And that was the end of the first day. Walking back through the 2 high corridors toward their quarters, Dale moved beside Mira and kept his voice low. The question had been sitting in his chest since the offer was placed on the table. "Are we actually going to negotiate with this?" he asked. "Any of it?" Mira was quiet for a few steps. She had her notes folder under one arm and her eyes on the corridor ahead. Then she said, "We're going to respond to it. That's different." Dale thought about that. And if they don't move? If every session just brings more of the same? Mira glanced at him once. There was something in her expression that was not worry and was not quite a smile, something that lived in the space between them, patient and certain. "Then they'll find out what happens when we stop responding," she said. She turned at the next junction toward her own quarters, and Dale kept walking. That night, he sat at his small viewport again. The distant lights of the human ships were still there, just visible at the edge of seeing, holding their position in the dark. They had been told to stay out there, and so they were staying. Patient, still. Waiting, the way something waits when it has already decided and is simply choosing the right moment. Dale looked at those lights until they blurred, and then he finally went to sleep. 3 weeks had passed since the first session, and nothing had changed, except the way the Accord looked at them. It was a small thing at first. Counselor Asa began arriving to sessions 4 or 5 minutes late. Not long enough to be a formal insult, but long enough to be noticed. He would walk in without apology, settle into his wide chair, and arrange his documents slowly, as if the humans on the other side of the table were simply furniture he had to work around. His 2 assistants had started doing the same thing, taking their cues from him, learning his rhythm of disrespect. Dale noticed it every time. He sat at the far end of the human delegation table, his job being to record everything, and so he watched everything. He watched Asa's slow movements. He watched the way Asa's long fingers tapped the table when Junho was speaking, as if counting down the seconds until he could talk again. He watched the way Asa looked at the human delegation, not with hate, not even with anger, but with something that felt worse than both: boredom. Junho never reacted. That was the thing Dale kept coming back to. Every session, every late arrival, every small dismissal, Junho sat straight, spoke clearly, and kept his face completely still. He would present the human counterproposals in calm, measured words. He would listen to the Accord's responses without expression. He would ask questions when needed, and stay silent when silence was the better choice. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked like a man who was simply doing his job. But Dale had started to understand that there was something underneath that stillness. Something patient in the way a stone wall is patient. Not because it cannot move, but because it has decided not to yet. The sessions themselves had fallen into a tired pattern. The Accord would present a modified proposal. The human team would review it overnight. Mira and her small team of analysts would go line by line through every word, checking not just what was written, but what was missing, what had been quietly shifted, what new language had been dropped into old paragraphs like stones into still water. By morning, they would have a full picture. Then Junho would sit back down at the table and respond. One morning, Mira walked into the delegation's working room and placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of Dale without saying anything. He picked it up and read it. Then he read it again. The Accord had offered a reduction in the reparations figure, a real one, almost 40% lower than the original number. It looked, on the surface, like real progress, the kind of movement that suggested the talks were finally going somewhere. Dale had felt something loosen in his chest when he first heard about it the night before. But the sheet Mira had given him showed the full picture. In the same revised document, buried on the third page in quiet legal language, the navigational rights clause had been expanded. What had originally covered 2 border systems now covered 4. The Accord had reduced the number they were asking for in money and quietly doubled what they were taking in territory rights. They had handed the humans a coin, while their other hand was moving the furniture. Dale set the paper down. He looked at Mira. She was already pouring herself a cup of the bitter human coffee they had brought from the shuttle, the one small comfort the delegation had brought from home. "Do we bring this up in session?" Dale asked. "Junho already knows," she said. "He read it at 4 in the morning. And?" She just drank her coffee and looked out the small viewport at the stars. The session that day went normally. Junho thanked the Accord for the revised reparations figure. He said the human delegation would review the full document carefully. He did not mention the expanded navigational clause. Asa, for the first time in days, looked almost pleased. His fingers had stopped tapping. It was Yuna who changed everything, and she did it quietly, the way she did most things. She came to Junho's room that evening, carrying a small data tablet. She had a habit of delivering important information in person, rather than over any comm line, a habit that had served the human delegation well more than once. She handed him the tablet without a word, and stood near the door while he read it. The tablet showed a transcript. One of Yuna's monitoring systems had caught a fragment of a private communication between 2 members of the Accord delegation during a recess earlier that day. The translation was rough in places, but clear enough in meaning. Counselor Rowe had said it to one of his staff, casual and quiet, believing the channel was clean. "They won't leave, they have nowhere to go." Junho read the line twice. He set the tablet face down on the table in front of him. He sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up the tablet again and handed it back to Yuna. "Keep this logged and secured," he said. "Full record." "Already done," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "Get Admiral Tejo on a secure line, not the diplomatic channel. Use the deep frequency we tested at Daesong. Tell him to move the fleet to waypoint Daesong and hold position there until he hears from me directly." Yuna gave a single nod. She left without asking any questions. That was one of the things Junho valued most about her. She understood that some instructions did not need to be explained because the explanation would come later, and the action needed to happen now. Dale had been standing in the hallway outside when Yuna passed him on her way out. He had only heard the last part of what Junho said. Something about a waypoint, something about the fleet. He went to the doorway and looked in. Junho was sitting at the small table in his room, both hands flat on the surface, staring at the far wall. "Sir," Dale said. Junho looked at him. His expression had not changed from what it always was, still and controlled. But something about the room felt different. Dale couldn't explain it exactly. It was the way a sky feels different in the hour before a storm, when nothing has happened yet, but the air already knows. "Get some sleep," Junho said. "Tomorrow's session will be long." Dale went back to his room. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and thought about the word nowhere, about what it meant that the Accord believed it. They had watched 3 weeks of human patience and had read it as proof that the humans had no other option. They had mistaken stillness for surrender. They had seen a delegation that kept showing up, kept negotiating, kept offering reasonable counters, and had concluded that the humans were grateful just to be at the table. They had not considered the other possibility, that the humans were not staying because they had nowhere to go, that they were staying because they were not finished deciding. Dale didn't fully understand what was coming, but as he lay back on his bed and stared at the metal ceiling of the station, he thought about Mira's face when she looked out the viewport, that faint, quiet smile, and he thought about the way Junho had said the word directly when he talked about the fleet. He thought about all of it for a long time before sleep finally came. Outside the station, in the cold dark between stars, a fleet that the Accord had never fully counted began to move. The morning of the 24th session felt like every other morning on the station. The lights in the corridor came on at the same time they always did. The air had the same faint metallic smell it always carried. The Accord staff moved through the hallways with the same unhurried pace, the same quiet confidence of people who believed they already knew how the day would end. Nothing about the station suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. That was exactly how Junho had planned it. Dale walked beside him on the way to the chamber. He had a folder under his arm and a stylus in his hand, ready to record the session the way he recorded all of them. He noticed that Junho was dressed slightly differently today. The collar of his jacket was fully fastened, the way it was only during formal events. Mira walked on Junho's other side. She had not spoken since breakfast. None of the senior members of the delegation had spoken much that morning, and at the time, Dale had thought it was simply tiredness. 3 weeks of difficult, grinding negotiations had worn on all of them. He understood later that it was not tiredness. They had simply already said everything they needed to say to each other. Everything had already been decided. The chamber was the same as always. The high ceiling, the wide table, the seats that were just slightly too large for human bodies. The light source directly in the faces of the human delegation. Dale had stopped noticing these things after the first week, but today, walking in for the last time, he noticed all of them again. Counselor Vale was already seated. For once, so was Asa. He had arrived on time today, which was unusual enough that Dale noted it. Rose sat at the far end of the Accord side, thick arms folded, watching the humans take their seats with the flat, measuring look he always wore. Several Accord aides filled the remaining chairs. The session opened the way they all opened. Vale spoke first, welcoming the delegations, noting the date for the official record. His voice was smooth and formal. He was good at this, at making everything sound reasonable, at wrapping difficult things in careful language until they felt soft and acceptable. Then he began reading the Accord's newest proposal. Dale had his stylus moving within seconds, recording the key points. The reparations figure was there, still reduced from the original. Some language around border monitoring had been softened. There were 2 new subclauses about trade access that appeared, on the surface, to give human merchants slightly better terms in Accord-adjacent space. Then Vale reached the new clause. It was on the 4th page of the document. Vale read it the same way he read everything, smoothly, without emphasis, as if it were simply one more item in a list of reasonable arrangements. The translation in Dale's earpiece rendered it in clean, plain language. The clause would give the Galactic Accord the formal authority to review and approve human military deployments within human border systems. Any movement of human fleet assets above a certain size would require prior notification to the Accord and could be suspended pending a council review. The stated reason was mutual security and regional stability. Dale's stylus stopped moving. He looked up from his notes. He looked at Mira. Her face was completely still, which told him nothing, because her face was always still when things were serious. He looked at Junho. Junho was watching Vale read. His expression had not changed. He looked the same way he had looked every single day for 3 weeks. Calm, present, unhurried. He let Vale finish the entire proposal. Every word, every clause, every polite, careful sentence. He did not interrupt. He did not shift in his chair. He simply listened until Vale closed his document and looked across the table with that smooth, practiced expression that said, "Your turn." Junho looked at him for a moment. Then he closed his own folder. The sound it made was very small, just the soft press of a cover against paper, but in the quiet of the chamber, it was somehow loud. Dale heard it clearly. He saw Vale blink. Junho straightened his jacket with both hands. One button at the collar, checked. Sleeves, settled. It took about 4 seconds. Then he placed both palms flat on the table, and pushed his chair back and stood up. The entire human delegation stood with him. Every single person. Mira, Dale, the 3 senior aides, the 2 junior analysts at the end of the table, rose at exactly the same moment. Not almost the same moment. Exactly. There was no hesitation, no glancing around to see what others were doing. They had all known. Every one of them had known this was coming, and had been ready for it. And now they were standing, and the Accord side of the table had gone very quiet. Vale's mouth opened. "Envoy Junho, we have not yet opened the floor for—" "Thank you for your time, Counselor." Junho's voice was polite, completely polite. There was no anger in it, no heat, no drama. He could have been thanking someone for passing the salt. A beat of silence. "We're done here." Asa made a sound, a short, low sound that was unmistakably a laugh. He leaned toward the aide sitting next to him and said something in his own language. His body had the loose, relaxed look of someone watching a small animal try to do something threatening. His colleague did not respond. His colleague was not relaxed. His colleague had gone the particular color that, according to the intelligence files Yuna had prepared, indicated acute stress in that species. He was staring at the standing human delegation with an expression that Dial, even with limited experience, recognized as alarm. The humans walked toward the chamber door in a single, quiet group. No rushing, no dramatic turns. They simply moved, together, with the calm and purpose of people who had somewhere better to be. Junho stopped at the door. He did not turn around. He stood with his back to the chamber, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, and he spoke to the room. His voice carried clearly to every corner. "We came here willing to be reasonable," he said. "You came here to see how much you could take. Now you'll find out what happens when we stop offering you things." He stepped through the door. The door slid shut behind them. For a moment, the Accord chamber was completely silent. Then Vale turned to his nearest aide and said one word, quietly, in Accord standard. The aide's hands were already moving over his console before Vale finished saying it. The sensor display came up on the room's main screen. The outer range map, the holding coordinates where the human fleet had been sitting, patient and still, for the past 3 weeks. The coordinates were empty. The aide ran the scan again. He checked the adjacent sectors. He widened the range. He checked again. He looked up at Vale with an expression that had no diplomatic training behind it. Just a raw, open look that said exactly what he was thinking without any words at all. Rowe unfolded his arms slowly. He stood up from his chair. He walked to the display and looked at it for a long time without speaking. In the back of the room, one of the junior Accord staff had pulled up an old file from the intelligence archive, something that had been automatically flagged when the human delegation's biometric signatures left the chamber. He stared at the title on the screen. He had never seen it before. It had been filed long ago, before the Cathara incident, before the blockade, before any of this. He read the title twice. Assessment of Human Psychological Combat Thresholds. Classification. Do not underestimate. He looked at the date it was filed. He looked at the date it was last opened. The Accord sent the first message 6 hours after the humans left. It was addressed to Junho directly, marked urgent, and written in the kind of careful diplomatic language that tried very hard to sound calm while being anything but. It asked the human delegation to reconsider their departure. It used the word productive 4 times in 3 paragraphs. It suggested that a short recess might help both sides return to the table with fresh perspective. It received no reply. The second message came 12 hours later. This one was slightly less polished. Some of the careful language was still there, but underneath it there was something tighter, something that pressed against the formal words, like a hand pressing against a closed door. It asked whether the human delegation intended to return to the station. It noted that the Accord remained committed to a peaceful resolution. It asked for confirmation that communication lines were still open. It also received no reply. By the time the third message was sent, the tone had changed in a way that no amount of diplomatic training could fully hide. The words were still formal, still arranged in the correct order, still addressed with the proper titles, but the meaning underneath them was different now. The Accord was not asking anymore. They were trying to understand what they were dealing with, and they were finding that they did not have a good answer. On the human command ship, parked deep in the quiet dark of Waypoint Daesong, Admiral Tejo read all 3 messages in sequence. He was a broad, unhurried man with short gray hair, and the kind of stillness that came not from calmness, but from long experience, from having stood in enough difficult situations to know that panic was simply wasted energy. He read the messages, set his tablet down on the edge of his command console, and looked out at the space beyond the ship's forward viewport. There was a lot of space out there. That was something people forgot, he thought, when they drew their maps and marked their territories and decided what belonged to whom. Space was not a room with walls. It was an ocean without a bottom, and the Accord had spent the last 3 weeks assuming they understood exactly where the humans were swimming. They had been wrong about that. Yuna came to the command deck, carrying a data folder and a second cup of tea, which she set near Tejo's console without being asked. She had been on the ship for 2 days now, transferred from the station the same quiet way the rest of the human staff had been, gradually, efficiently, without any single moment that the Accord could point to and say, there, that was when they started leaving. By the time the Accord had noticed the pattern, the embassy offices had already been dark for 36 hours. They've started counting, Yuna said, opening her folder. Tejo looked at her. What are they counting? Us. She placed a report on the console in front of him. Their intelligence teams have been running assessments since yesterday. They're trying to get an accurate number for the full fleet. She paused. They're having trouble. Tejo looked at the report. He said nothing for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. Good. The trouble the Accord was having was not an accident. For the better part of 2 years, while the diplomatic process had been grinding through its early stages, the Human Confederacy had been doing something the Accord had not considered worth monitoring carefully. They had been building. Not loudly, not in the places the Accord's intelligence assets were pointed, but steadily and with great patience. The same patience, it turned out, that the human delegation had been showing at the negotiation table. New ships, built in human systems far from the border. New crews, trained quietly. A second fleet that existed not as a weapon aimed at anything, but as a fact. A weight placed on the scale for the moment when the scale needed balancing. Tejo called it the argument they had hoped they would never need to make. He was making it now. The operation at the Kethera systems was clean and fast. 3 colony systems that the Accord had blockaded 2 years ago, the original wound that had started all of this, were the first priority. Tejo's fleet moved to all 3 simultaneously, not in waves, not in sequence, but at the same moment, coordinated across the distance between systems, with the kind of precision that required months of preparation and the kind of nerve that required something harder to name. The Accord vessels already in those systems were outnumbered at each location before their commanders had finished reading the first sensor report. They were given 48 hours to withdraw peacefully. The message was delivered once, clearly, without repetition or negotiation. They were gone in 6 hours. No shots were fired, not one. That was important to Tejo. Not because he was afraid of the fight, but because a clean, bloodless repositioning told a different story than a battle did. A battle could be called many things. It could be disputed, minimized, reframed. What had happened at Kethera could not be reframed. It was simply 3 systems, previously taken, now returned, and the ships that had taken them retreating in good order, because the alternative had been made very clear. Back on the Accord Central Station, the emergency session had been running for hours. Asa was talking. He had been talking for a long time. His voice had lost its boredom, and replaced it with something sharp and fast. The kind of talking that came when a person was frightened, and needed the sound of their own words to feel less frightened. He was arguing that the human movement was a prelude to war, that the Accord needed to respond with full force immediately, before the humans consolidated their position further. He used the word aggression many times. He had been sitting in his chair with his arms folded and his eyes on the table for most of the session, and when Asa finally paused for breath, Ro looked up and said 4 words. "Read the old file." The room went quiet. Vale had already read it. He had read it the night before, alone in his office, and he had not slept after. The file was not long. It was a single assessment, written by an Accord intelligence analyst more than a decade ago, after the first formal contact with humanity. It documented human history, human conflict patterns, human psychology under pressure. It was thorough, careful, and deeply uncomfortable reading. Its conclusion, written plainly at the end, was this: humans were not a species that broke under pressure. They were a species that reorganized under pressure. The worse the situation, the more unified they became. The more they were pushed, the more efficiently they moved. And critically, unlike most species the Accord had encountered, humans did not need to be winning to keep fighting. They needed only to believe that the alternative to fighting was worse. Vale closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at the sensor display on the room's main screen, which now showed Tejo's fleet in clean, undeniable detail. The real numbers, finally counted, finally visible. The number was considerably larger than anyone in the room had previously believed. On the human command ship, Dale found Mira standing in front of the star map in the navigation room. The map showed the fleet positions as small points of light spread wide across the border region, patient, still, simply present. He stood beside her and looked at it for a while, without speaking. Then he asked the question he had been carrying for days. Were we always going to do this? Mira held her tea in both hands and thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about everything. We were always ready to, she said. There's a difference. She looked at the map a moment longer. We kept hoping they would make it unnecessary. Dale looked at the lights on the map. He thought about Junho at that table. 3 weeks, every session. He thought about what patience actually meant when it was chosen, not forced. Outside, the stars were very still. Then Yuna's voice came over the ship's internal channel, quiet and direct. Message incoming. Priority diplomatic signal. It's Vale. A short pause. Asa is not on the channel. Teho leaned forward in his chair. He read the message once. He forwarded it to Junho without comment. The word regrettable appeared 4 times in the opening paragraph alone. The Accord accepted every condition without negotiation. That was the part Dale kept thinking about on the shuttle ride over. Not the conditions themselves. He had read them, had helped Mira check every line of the single-page document 3 times the night before. But the acceptance. How fast it had come. How clean it was. No counteroffer, no request for clarification, no polite suggestion that perhaps 1 or 2 points could be revisited. Just a formal reply, sent within the hour, confirming that the Accord delegation would attend at the time and place specified by the human side. The time and place specified by the human side. 3 weeks ago they had been sitting in chairs that were too large, squinting into a light source aimed directly at their faces, breathing air that had been set at the low end of human comfort range. Now, the Accord delegation was boarding a shuttle to a human station, in human space, and nobody on their side had said a single word about it. Dale looked out the shuttle window as they approached the station. It was a working station, functional, solid, built for purpose rather than impression. It did not have the high ceilings and wide corridors of Accord Station. It did not have the architecture designed to remind visitors of their smallness. It was simply a place where humans worked, and today it was the place where the Accord would sign what Juno had put in front of them. The meeting chamber was well lit. The chairs fit. The air was correct. Dale sat down and felt, for the first time in weeks, like he was sitting in a room that had been built for him to exist in comfortably. It was such a simple thing that it almost felt strange. The Accord delegation arrived exactly on time. He looked different from the man who had sat across the table at Accord Station. Not physically different, but in the way he carried himself. The smooth, unhurried confidence was still there in the surface of things, in the careful way he walked and the formal way he greeted the room. But underneath it, something had shifted. He moved like a man who was paying close attention to every step, not because he was afraid of falling, but because he had recently been reminded that falling was possible. Ro followed behind him. He looked at the room, looked at the human delegation, looked at the table. He said nothing, which was what he usually did. But the silence felt different now. Before, his silence had carried the weight of someone who had no need to speak because everything was already going the way he wanted. Now it carried a different weight, the weight of someone who was thinking carefully before committing to anything. Asa was not there. No explanation was offered when the delegations took their seats, and for a moment nobody addressed it. Then Vale folded his hands on the table and said, without being asked, that Counselor Asa had been reassigned to an internal review process and would not be present for the session. His voice was even when he said it, professional. He did not look at anyone in particular. Junho nodded once. He did not ask any follow-up questions. He did not look at the empty chair. He simply opened the thin folder in front of him and placed the document on the table and slid it across to Vale's side with one hand. 1 page. That was all it was. Dale had looked at it long enough to know every word on it, and it was still remarkable to him how much had been decided in so little space. The 6 border systems were confirmed as human sovereign territory, stated plainly, with no qualifying language around them. The navigational rights clause, the one that had started everything, the one that had been expanded and re-expanded and buried deeper in each new version of the Accord's proposals, was gone entirely. Not reduced, not revised, gone. The Accord observation vessel arrangement had been removed in the same way. The reparations, the ones the Accord had wanted humanity to pay for a blockade the Accord had imposed, were not on the page at all. Instead, on line 3, in simple and direct language, was an Accord acknowledgement that the Kethera blockade had been an unlawful act conducted against a sovereign human territory. Line 3, not buried on page 4 in careful legal language. Line 3, plain as anything, where anyone who ever read the document would see it immediately. Vale read the document in full. The room was quiet while he did. His face was composed and showed very little, which Dial had come to understand was not the same thing as feeling very little. When Vale finished reading, he looked up, and for just a moment, he seemed like he was going to say something. Some last careful phrase, some small attempt to adjust one edge of one clause. Old habit, probably. The instinct of a man who had spent his whole career finding the soft places in agreements. Rowe put his hand on the table, not touching Vale, not grabbing anything, just placing his hand flat on the surface in a quiet, steady way. He did not look at Vale when he did it. He was looking at the document. Vale closed his mouth. He looked at the document again. Then he picked up the signing stylus. Nobody spoke while he signed. The scratch of the stylus was the only sound in the room. When he was finished, he set it down and slid the document back across the table to Junho, who signed it without fanfare, and closed the folder and set it to one side, as if it were simply the next task completed in an ordinary day. Then Vale said something that Dale had not expected. He said it quietly, without ceremony, looking at the table rather than at Junho directly. He said that the Accord recognized it had approached the process poorly. He used the word regrettable again. It seemed to be the word his generation of diplomats reached for when they needed to acknowledge something without fully naming it. But he said it, with less performance than it usually carried, and Dale thought that counted for something, even if it did not count for everything. Junho looked at him for a moment. "We know," he said simply. Then he stood, and the session was over. Walking back through the corridor toward the shuttle bay, Dale fell into step beside Junho. The rest of the delegation was a few paces behind, talking quietly among themselves. The first relaxed conversation he had heard from any of them in weeks. Mira was laughing at something one of the aides had said. It was a good sound. Dale had been turning a question over in his mind since the session ended. He had been trying to find the right way to ask it, and had decided there was no right way, so he just asked it. Was this always the plan? Walk out? Show force? Come back winning? Junho was quiet for a few steps. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at the corridor ahead of them. Dale had learned by now that Junho's silences were not empty. They were him choosing the right words, which he always did eventually. The plan, Junho said, was to never need to use the force, to negotiate fairly and go home. He glanced back once at the closed door of the signing chamber behind them. They changed the plan. We just adapted faster than they thought we could. Dale thought about that the whole way home. Later, in the Accord's intelligence archive, a new file was created and given the highest classification level the system allowed. It documented the full sequence of events, the walkout, the fleet movement, the Kethera systems, the signing. At the bottom of the file, a single note had been added by an analyst whose name was not attached to it. It read, Do not mistake their patience for weakness. They were never waiting because they had no choice. They were waiting because they were deciding. Below that, one more line, added after a pause, it seemed. The cursor mark was slightly off from the rest of the text, as if the analyst had come back to add it after sitting with the thought for a while. Next time, read the file.